The church smelled faintly of lilies and dust. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows in fractured colors, but none of it could warm Eleanor Wright. Her husband's coffin rested at the front, polished to a gleam, surrounded by flowers that looked too alive, too beautiful for a day like this. Eleanor sat in the front pew, her hands trembling in her lap, while the whispers of her children floated behind her like shards of glass. "Finally, it's over," Victoria murmured. "Now we can get on with our lives." Eleanor flinched. Her daughter didn't lower her voice. Bradley chuckled in reply. Eleanor didn't turn around. She couldn't. They were her children, her flesh, her blood. Yet in that moment, they felt like strangers. She pressed her eyes shut, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw Thomas's face as he had been in their final days, tired, but still managing that wry smile when he squeezed her hand. "Trust me," he had whispered. "Everything will be all right." But nothing felt all right. 42 years of marriage, gone. 4 decades of building a life together, of morning coffees and evening walks, of arguments that ended in laughter and challenges overcome side by side. Thomas had been her compass, her partner, her friend. Now she was adrift. The minister's words washed over her, platitudes about a good man gone to his reward. Eleanor barely heard them. Thomas had been more than good. He had been brilliant, stubborn, occasionally frustrating, and endlessly loving. How could such a complex life be reduced to these simple phrases? The service ended. Guests filed out, offering brief condolences that slid past Eleanor like smoke. Bradley and Victoria stood nearby, accepting sympathies with practiced solemnity, though their eyes were bright, not with grief, but with anticipation. Eleanor had seen that look before when they were children on Christmas morning, eyeing packages under the tree. But they weren't children anymore, and this was no celebration. "Mrs. Wright," a gentle touch on her elbow. William Matthews, Thomas's attorney for the past 20 years, stood beside her. "It's time for the reading." Eleanor nodded, gathering herself. She stood stiff and followed Matthews into a small adjoining room where the will would be read. Bradley and Victoria were already there, perched on chairs, their postures alert. Matthews cleared his throat and unfolded the papers. "The last will and testament of Thomas James Wright." His voice was dry, formal, but each word seemed to slice Eleanor open. "To my beloved children," he read, "I leave the sum of $12 million to be divided equally, as well as the 2 new vehicles purchased this year." Victoria gasped in delight. Bradley exhaled a laugh of triumph. Eleanor's stomach sank, not because of the money, she had never cared about that, but because of the gleam in her children's eyes. This was what mattered to them. Not the empty chair at the dining table, not the silence that would fill the house. Just this. Matthews paused, adjusted his glasses, then continued. "To my wife, my dearest companion of 42 years, I leave this letter." He placed a sealed envelope in Eleanor's hands. Bradley and Victoria stared at her, stunned for a moment, then erupted into laughter. "A letter after everything, that's all you get." Victoria's voice dripped with cruelty. "Looks like Dad thought you'd had enough," Bradley added with a smirk. Eleanor sat frozen, the envelope heavy as stone in her lap. Their laughter echoed in the small room, sharp and merciless. "I guess you'll have to live off memories while we handle the money," Bradley said, leaning back. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the envelope. Thomas's handwriting danced across it, steady, deliberate. He had chosen every word, every stroke of the pen. Her fingers traced the seal, and for the first time since his death, she felt something stir inside her. Not despair, not defeat. Something quieter, deeper. Hope. She slipped the letter into her purse. Whatever secret it held, she would uncover it alone. Eleanor waited until nightfall to open the envelope. The children had left hours earlier, giddy with their sudden wealth, too busy calling banks and friends to spare her another word. The house felt cavernous without Thomas's voice filling it, the silence broken only by the creak of old wood and the faint hum of the refrigerator. She sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning. Her hands shook as she slit the envelope open. Inside was a single folded page, thick paper written in Thomas's familiar, meticulous script. "My love," it began. "By now you will have endured the cruelty of our children's laughter. I did not intend it to be this way, but I needed to reveal their hearts before I revealed the truth. They think they have won, but what they hold is only a shadow. What is real, I have left to you." Eleanor pressed the page to her lips, her throat tightening. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. He had known. He had known how they would treat her. "You will find in this letter a small key. It belongs to a safe deposit box at the bank on Ashland Avenue. Everything I could not trust them with rests inside. You alone are meant to open it. Do not let anyone know. Do not let them take this from you. Trust yourself as I have trusted you. With love always, Thomas." A small metallic clink fell into her palm as she unfolded the paper further. A tiny brass key, its number etched faintly along the stem. She held it tight, as if afraid it would vanish. She sat for a long while staring at the key. Questions circled her mind. What could possibly be in that safe money? Documents. Something he didn't want the children to touch. Her pulse quickened with both fear and anticipation. She thought of Victoria's sneer, the way Bradley had leaned back, triumphant, as though she had been dismissed from her own life. For years she had endured their disregard, small slights, dismissive words, choices made over her head. She had excused them, told herself they were young or stressed or simply didn't understand. But today, when they laughed at her, she saw their true selves. And Thomas had seen it, too. Eleanor tucked the letter and the key into her purse, then carried the purse to the bedroom, sliding open the top drawer of her nightstand. She placed them beneath a stack of folded scarves, hidden from any wandering eyes. That night, she barely slept. Each sound outside made her think of footsteps. Each shadow on the wall became a threat. But beneath the unease, there was something else, a flicker of resolve. Tomorrow she would go to the bank. Tomorrow she would learn what Thomas had truly left her. And tomorrow her children's laughter might not echo so loudly. She drifted off remembering the day they bought this house, 40 years ago. They could barely afford it, but Thomas had insisted. "We're building something here. Ellie," he'd said, his arm around her waist. "Not just walls and a roof, a legacy." What had become of that legacy? Where had they gone wrong with Bradley and Victoria? Bradley had always been ambitious, even as a child. He wanted more toys, more attention, more praise. Eleanor remembered him at 8 years old, angry because his baseball trophy wasn't as big as his friends. "It's not fair," he'd cried. She and Thomas had tried to teach him that life wasn't measured in trophies or dollars. But somewhere along the way, those lessons had been forgotten. Victoria had been different once, sensitive, artistic. Eleanor remembered her daughter at 12, painting for hours, creating worlds of color and light. But something changed in high school. Suddenly it was all about the right clothes, the right friends, the right appearance. The paints were packed away. The easel gathered dust. Victoria learned to measure worth by price tags. Eleanor had watched, helpless, as her children transformed. Thomas had seen it too, his eyes sad when they visited with stories only of acquisitions and status. But neither of them had ever imagined their children would look at them with such naked contempt. As dawn broke, Eleanor rose, feeling older than her 68 years, but somehow steadier. She dressed carefully in a simple blue dress and low heels. She applied light makeup, combed her silver hair back neatly, and fastened her mother's pearl earrings. Small rituals of normalcy in a world suddenly unfamiliar. The morning air was cool and brittle as she drove herself to the bank on Ashland Avenue, a modest brick building with tall glass doors. Her heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her throat. The brass key in her purse clinked with each step she took, like a secret whisper reminding her of what was at stake. The teller, a young woman with careful eyes, led Eleanor into a small private room after checking the number on her key. "One moment," she said softly, disappearing into the vault. Eleanor sat in the silence, Her hands clasped until the teller returned carrying a long, narrow box. She placed it on the table, nodded politely, and left Eleanor alone. Her fingers hovered above the lid. She thought of Thomas, his quiet strength, his meticulous planning, his last words to her. "Trust me." With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no stack of dollar bills, as she had half expected. Instead, there were neat folders bound with twine in a thick leather journal. Her pulse quickened. On top of the files lay a sealed envelope marked in Thomas's handwriting, "For my wife's eyes only." She tore it open. "My dearest," the letter read, "what you see here are the records of my real estate holdings, investment accounts, and business shares. These assets are not included in the official will. They are hidden in trusts and accounts known only to me and Mr. Matthews. Their value is greater than the $12 million given to the children. Much greater. I leave all of this to you because I know only you will protect it, and only you will know how to honor what we built together." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling. Greater than $12 million, her children had strutted out of that reading like conquerors, but they had been handed scraps. Here, before her, lay the true weight of Thomas's legacy. The journal drew her attention next. She opened it carefully. His handwriting filled the pages, entries from the past year, sometimes weary, sometimes fierce. He wrote of his disappointment in the children, their greed, their disregard, their cruelty even toward each other. He wrote of his love for Eleanor, of his fear that after his death she would be alone against them. "This is why I chose this path," he had written. "Not to punish them, but to reveal them, and to give you the power to decide what comes next." The words blurred as tears slid down her cheeks. She felt a strange mixture of grief, relief, and something sharper, something she hadn't felt in years. Power. She gathered the files and the journal, sliding them back into the box. As she lifted it into her arms, one thought burned bright in her mind. Her children believed they had won, but they had no idea what their father had truly left behind. When she returned from the bank, the weight of the box pressed against her arms, as though it carried not only Thomas's fortune, but the burden of truth itself. She had hidden the files and journal inside her closet, beneath blankets in a trunk no one had touched for years. She told herself it would be safe there, but a seed of fear had already taken root in her. Fear of her own children. That evening, the front door slammed open. Bradley barged in first, tossing his keys on the counter, his voice booming through the hallway. Victoria trailed behind, her laughter sharp and brittle. They were flushed with excitement, as if drunk on their sudden wealth. "Mom!" Victoria called, sweeping into the living room with a grin too wide. You should have seen the dealership today. 2 brand-new cars gleaming in the sun. Dad really knew how to take care of us. Her words cut, deliberate and cruel. Eleanor forced a polite smile. "I'm glad you're happy." "Happy," Bradley echoed, striding in with his phone held up, showing off a picture of himself leaning against a luxury car. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. You should think about selling this old place. Mom, move somewhere smaller. You don't need all this space alone." Eleanor felt the sting beneath his casual tone. Smaller meant forgotten. Smaller meant tucked away, out of their way. She folded her hands in her lap, willing her voice to stay steady. "This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Victoria tilted her head, studying Eleanor with narrowed eyes. "You seem different," she said slowly. "Not as broken as I expected. Did Dad leave you something after all?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. Eleanor's heart thudded, but she kept her expression neutral. "He left me memories," she said softly. "That's enough." Victoria smirked, but her gaze sharpened, suspicious. Later, as Eleanor carried dishes into the kitchen, she heard the faint creak of her bedroom door upstairs. Her pulse spiked. Quietly, she climbed the staircase. The sight that met her froze her in place. Victoria crouched beside her dresser, rifling through drawers. "What are you doing?" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. Victoria jumped, spinning around. I was just looking for a photo album," she stammered. though her cheeks burned with guilt. "That's my private room," Eleanor said, steel slipping into her tone. "You will not search it again." Victoria's eyes flickered with something sharp resentment, perhaps even hatred, but she brushed past Eleanor without another word. That night, as the house settled into silence, Eleanor sat awake in bed, clutching Thomas's journal to her chest. Her children no longer saw her as a grieving widow. They sensed something they couldn't name, something that frightened them. They were right to be afraid, because for the first time in her life, Eleanor wasn't going to bend to them. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. Grief still weighed on her, but it had company now: determination. She spent the early hours reviewing Thomas's journal, learning the details of their assets, properties in 3 states, investments in technology firms, shares in companies she'd never heard of. The numbers made her head spin. She was making notes when the doorbell rang. Outside stood Mason Morrison, Victoria's 17-year-old son, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression guarded. "Grandma," he said quietly when she opened the door. "Can I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside, surprised. Mason had always been a quiet child, thoughtful in a way his mother was not, in recent years, as Victoria and Bradley had grown more consumed with status and wealth. Mason had retreated further into himself. Eleanor saw him at holidays and family gatherings, but those moments were brief, superficial. "I was sorry about Grandpa," he said, settling at the kitchen table. "The funeral. I couldn't really say anything with Mom and Uncle Bradley there." Eleanor placed a cup of tea in front of him. "I know, dear." Mason wrapped his long fingers around the mug, not drinking, just absorbing the warmth. "They've been weird since the will reading. Excited. Like they won something." He looked up, his eyes troubled. "Mom bought a new car yesterday, and she's talking about a vacation house in Florida." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Your grandfather left them a substantial amount." "But not you?" Mason asked, direct in that way teenagers could be. She considered her answer carefully. "He left me exactly what I needed." Mason studied her face, then nodded slowly, as if he understood something unspoken. "They think you got nothing. They've been laughing about it." The words stung, but Eleanor kept her expression steady. People often mistake silence for emptiness. They talked for nearly an hour, not about money or wills, but about Thomas stories Eleanor had almost forgotten. Moments Mason remembered from childhood fishing trips and Thanksgiving dinners. For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor felt the presence of her husband as a comfort rather than an absence. As Mason was leaving, he hesitated at the door. "Grandma, be careful. Mom, she's different lately. More calculating." Eleanor touched his cheek gently. "I'll be fine, but thank you for caring." After he left, Eleanor returned to Thomas's journal. On one page, she found a passage that made her pause. "Mason visited today. While the others talk of what they'll buy with their inheritance, he asked about my first business failure, what I learned from it. There's something in him. Ellie. Something true. Remember that when the storm comes." The storm. Thomas had seen it gathering on the horizon long before she had. Now she could feel the first winds herself. That afternoon, she called William Matthews. His secretary put her through immediately. "Eleanor," Matthews said, his voice warm with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I've opened the safe deposit box," she said quietly. "I need to understand everything. Can we meet?" "Of course. Tomorrow morning." "Perfect." She hung up and walked to the window, watching the neighborhood children ride bikes in the late afternoon sun. Once, Bradley and Victoria had been among them, carefree and innocent. When had that changed? Had she and Thomas been so focused on providing that they'd forgotten to teach value? Or was there something in her children that would have emerged regardless, some seed of entitlement that had been waiting for the right conditions to bloom? Eleanor was setting the table for a solitary dinner when the phone rang again. It was Victoria. "Mother." Her voice was honey-sweet, a tone Eleanor recognized from childhood demands. "Bradley and I are hosting a family dinner Saturday night, at my house. We'd love for you to come." "That sounds nice," Eleanor said carefully. "Wear something nice, Mom. You'll want to see how well we're doing." After hanging up, Eleanor stood still in the kitchen, the invitation lingering like a threat. They wanted to show off, to rub their wealth in her face. Part of her wanted to decline, to avoid another round of subtle cruelty. But another part, the part awakening with each passing day, wanted to see exactly what they were planning. She would go, she would observe, and she would remember that beneath their designer clothes and arrogant smiles, her children were afraid of something they couldn't quite name. They sensed a shift in power, even if they didn't understand it yet. Eleanor returned to her bedroom and opened the trunk where she'd hidden Thomas's documents. She extracted one folder labeled Primary Residence and studied it carefully. The house, their home for 4 decades, was held in a trust, not part of the estate. Bradley couldn't force her to sell or downsize. It was hers, secure. She smiled for the first time in days. Thomas had thought of everything. As she replaced the folder, her hand brushed against a smaller envelope she hadn't noticed before. Inside was a key to another safe deposit box and a note. For emergencies only. Share with no one. Eleanor held the second key, wondering what other safeguards Thomas had put in place. He had known their children better than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. While she had been making excuses for their behavior, he had been building protections. The house phone rang again. This time it was Bradley. "Mom, I've been thinking about your situation," he said without preamble. "You're all alone in that big house. It's a lot to maintain. I know a great retirement community." "I'm not interested in moving. Bradley," she interrupted, her voice firmer than it had been in years. "But Mom, my home is not up for discussion." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. When Bradley spoke again, his voice had an edge. "We're just concerned about you, that's all. Living alone at your age can be dangerous." "I'm 68, not 98, Eleanor replied. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my affairs." After she hung up, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, Thomas's journal open before her. "They will circle," he had written. "Testing for weakness. Give them nothing. The true inheritance isn't what they can take, but what they can earn through love and respect. They have forgotten this. Perhaps they will remember, perhaps not. Either way, you must be ready." Eleanor closed the journal, feeling Thomas's presence like a hand on her shoulder. She would be ready. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it standing tall. It was Victoria's idea to host a family dinner. She insisted it was to honor their father's memory. But Eleanor knew better. The invitation was laced with arrogance. Victoria's voice on the phone smug as she said, "Wear something nice, Mom. You'll want to see how well we're doing." Eleanor arrived at Victoria's suburban mansion with a heavy heart. The house itself was new, purchased just 6 months ago when Victoria's third husband, James Morrison, had received a promotion at his investment firm. It was ostentatious, with a circular driveway and columns flanking the entrance. Nothing like the modest, warm home where Eleanor had raised her children. The dining room glittered with new furniture, a mahogany table, silver candlesticks, and expensive china that had never been touched before. Bradley lounged at the head of the table, Thomas's place a glass of wine in his hand, while Victoria flitted about. Her smile stretched thin. Mason greeted Eleanor with a genuine hug, the only warmth in the room. "I'm glad you came, Grandma," he whispered. When Eleanor sat down, the conversation immediately turned to their recent purchases. 2 cars weren't enough, Bradley boasted, swirling his wine. "I put a down payment on a boat yesterday. Dad's money should be enjoyed, not locked away." Victoria laughed, her diamond earrings catching the light. "I'm looking at a vacation home in Florida. You should come visit. Mom, though I'm not sure you'd enjoy the upkeep. Too much responsibility." Their words dripped with mockery. Eleanor forced herself to take a bite of food, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. She glanced at Mason, who stared at his plate, his face tight with discomfort. "How's school going?" Mason, Eleanor asked, attempting to steer the conversation away from money. Before Mason could answer, Victoria jumped in. "We're considering private school now, perhaps St. Andrews. No reason for him to settle for public education with our new resources." "I like my school," Mason said quietly. "My friends are there." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. You'll make better connections at St. Andrews. That's what matters in life. Eleanor thought of Victoria at Mason's age, bright, creative, with dreams of becoming an artist. Where had that girl gone? What had turned her into this calculating woman who measured relationships by their utility? Speaking of education, Bradley interjected, I've been thinking about your finances. Mom, have you considered what you're going to do now? You can't exactly live on memories. I'll manage, Eleanor replied evenly. Maybe it's time to downsize, Victoria suggested, her voice falsely sweet. This big old house must be such a burden for you alone. That house is my home, Eleanor said. Your father and I built our life there. Yes, but Dad's gone now, Bradley said, his voice hardening. And times change. You're not getting any younger. Then my son leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Mom, he said, his voice casual but edged with steel. Did Dad really leave you only that letter? Nothing else? The table fell silent. Victoria's gaze sharpened. Waiting. Eleanor set her fork down carefully, feeling the heat of their suspicion press against her. For years she had lowered her eyes, avoided conflict, let them steamroll her. But Thomas's journal sat hidden in her trunk, his words burning in her mind. Give yourself the power. Decide what comes next. She lifted her chin. Yes, he left me a letter, and it was worth more than any car or boat or vacation house you could buy. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, really? And what did this precious letter say? That's between your father and me, Eleanor replied, her voice calm, steady. Bradley's jaw tightened. He slammed his wine glass down so hard the stem cracked. Don't play games with us. If Dad left you something, we deserve to know. We're his children, too. Eleanor looked at him, at both of them, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small under their glare. She felt resolute. You may be his children, she said quietly, but you were never his legacy. The air shifted, heavy with tension. Victoria's eyes flashed, but she bit her tongue. Bradley muttered something under his breath, leaning back with a scowl. Mason glanced between them, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else admiration. Perhaps, as he looked at his grandmother, dinner ended soon after, the food barely touched. Eleanor declined Victoria's insincere offer of dessert and gathered her purse. I should be going, she said, standing. Thank you for dinner. I'll walk you to your car, Grandma, Mason offered, jumping up from his seat, outside, in the cool evening air. Mason touched Eleanor's arm. I've never heard you stand up to them like that before. Eleanor smiled softly. There's a lot I haven't done before, but it's never too late to start. They're going to come after you, Mason warned. They think you're hiding something. I know, Eleanor replied, but I'm not afraid anymore. She drove home under a moonless sky, her heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with certainty. They would come for her. She knew it. Their greed wouldn't allow them to rest, but she wasn't the same woman they thought they could laugh at. Not anymore. As she parked in her driveway, she noticed a car slowly driving past her house. She couldn't see the driver, but she didn't need to. The circling had begun. The storm came the next evening, not with rain or thunder, but with pounding fists against her front door. Eleanor opened it to find Bradley, his face red, his jaw tight. Behind him stood Victoria, arms crossed, her eyes sharp as blades. Enough games, Mom, Bradley snapped, pushing past her into the house. We know Dad left you more than just that letter. Eleanor steadied herself against the doorframe. You should leave. We're not leaving until you tell us the truth, Victoria hissed, stepping closer. Do you think you can sit there smug while we're left wondering what you're hiding? We're his blood. If there's more money, it belongs to us. Her words cut deep, not because of their meaning, but because of their emptiness. They spoke of entitlement, not love. Eleanor thought of the nights she had stayed awake nursing their fevers, the meals she had scraped together when money was tight, the endless sacrifices. None of it mattered to them now. I don't owe you an explanation, Eleanor said, her voice trembling, but firm. Bradley slammed a fist on the table. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We could make arrangements for you. A care facility, perhaps. Somewhere you won't have to worry about all these responsibilities. The threat hung heavy in the air. They weren't offering care. They were offering exile. Eleanor forced a calm breath, meeting their eyes. I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Victoria sneered, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. Bradley lingered a beat longer, his gaze searching Eleanor's face for cracks before following his sister into the night. The door slammed shut behind them, rattling the frame. Eleanor's hands shook as she locked it. She knew then they would not stop. Their greed had become hunger, insatiable and dangerous. She was about to call Matthews when she heard a soft knock at the back door. Her heart raced until she saw Mason's face through the window. She let him in quickly. I'm sorry, Grandma, he said, his voice low. I heard them planning to come here. I tried to stop them, but it's not your responsibility to manage your mother's behavior, Eleanor said gently. But thank you for caring. Mason shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. I recorded them earlier today at our house. They were talking about you, about what to do if you wouldn't cooperate. Eleanor's breath caught. You recorded them. Mason nodded, pulling out his phone. I didn't know what else to do. The way they were talking, it scared me. He pressed play, and suddenly Victoria's voice filled the kitchen, sharp and calculating. If she won't tell us what Dad left her, we need to take more drastic steps. She's nearly 70. We could make a case that she's not competent to manage her own affairs. Bradley's voice responded. The court would need evidence, medical evaluations. So we'll get them, Victoria snapped. There are doctors who understand how these things work. For the right price, they'll find evidence of cognitive decline. Then we get guardianship, access to everything. And if that doesn't work, Bradley asked, then we make her life so difficult she gives in. Everyone has a breaking point. The recording ended. Eleanor sat very still, absorbing the calculated cruelty of her own children. Mason watched her, his young face creased with worry. I'm sorry, he said again. I didn't want to upset you, but I thought you should know. Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. You did the right thing. Knowledge is protection. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice steadier. Your grandfather knew this might happen. He prepared for it. Mason's eyes widened. So there is something else he left you? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, but it's complicated. And dangerous, apparently, given how far your mother and uncle are willing to go. She rose and moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a framed photograph of Thomas and herself on their 40th anniversary. Behind it was a small wall safe she'd installed years ago, something even Victoria didn't know about. From it, she removed Thomas's journal and brought it back to the table. Your grandfather kept this the last year of his life, she explained, opening it to a marked page. He saw what was happening to your mother and uncle, how money had become their only measure of worth. He was afraid for me, after he was gone. Mason read silently, his expression growing more solemn with each line. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He knew they'd turn on you. He hoped they wouldn't, Eleanor corrected gently. But he prepared for the possibility. What are you going to do? Eleanor closed the journal. First, I'm going to call Mr. Matthews. Then I'm going to make sure your mother and uncle understand that I'm not as defenseless as they think. After Mason left, sneaking out the back way to avoid being seen, Eleanor called Matthews and arranged to meet him first thing in the morning. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She moved a heavy dresser in front of her bedroom door and slept with Thomas's journal under her pillow. In this house where she had raised her children, she no longer felt safe. The next morning, she drove to Matthew's office. His secretary ushered her into a paneled room where he sat behind a heavy oak desk, glasses perched low on his nose. They know, Eleanor whispered as soon as the door closed. Or at least they suspect. They threatened me last night. They're talking about having me declared incompetent. Matthews leaned back, folding his hands. Thomas prepared for this. The trusts are sealed. The assets are untouchable without your consent. Legally, you are safe. Legally, Eleanor echoed, the word bitter on her tongue. But what about otherwise? You didn't see the way they looked at me. He studied her for a long moment. You will need to be cautious. Do not let them know what you hold. And above all, do not underestimate them. Desperation makes people reckless. Eleanor nodded, clutching Thomas's journal inside her bag like a shield. As she left his office, the autumn wind caught at her coat, cold against her skin. She knew now that this wasn't only about inheritance. It was about survival. And if her children thought she would surrender, they had forgotten who raised them. Later that afternoon, Mason called. His voice was hushed, urgent. "Grandma, they're planning something. Mom's been on the phone with doctors all morning, and Uncle Bradley is talking to some lawyer about conservatorship procedures. I think they're moving fast." "Thank you for letting me know," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice calm for his sake. "Mason, you need to be careful. Don't put yourself at risk for me." "But what are you going to do?" he asked. Eleanor thought of the second key Thomas had left, the one she hadn't yet used. "I'm going to follow your grandfather's plan. He knew them better than I allowed myself to." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was familiar but different, her silver hair, the lines around her eyes, the set of her jaw. She looked like her own mother in her later years, a woman who had survived the Depression, who had rebuilt after losing everything, who had never bent even when the world tried to break her. "I won't bend either," Eleanor whispered to her reflection. Then she picked up the phone and made another appointment with Matthews for the following day. It was time to activate Thomas's final safeguard. Eleanor should have expected it, but the sight still hollowed her out. It was late afternoon when she returned from the market, bags of groceries digging into her arms. The front door stood ajar. A chill rippled through her. She stepped inside. The silence was louder than any noise. Upstairs, drawers yawned open. Her jewelry box lay tipped over, necklaces spilling like broken promises across the carpet. Her closet door hung wide, blankets tossed aside. The old trunk shoved out from its corner. The lock had been forced, splintered wood marking their impatience. They had been here, her children, searching for evidence, for documents, for anything that might confirm their suspicions. Eleanor sank to her knees beside the trunk, rifling through the mess with shaking hands. The journal was gone. The files, too. For a moment, panic stole the air from her lungs. Then her eyes caught the faint outline of the false bottom Thomas had built years ago. A hidden compartment, invisible unless you knew where to press. She lifted it. There, safe and untouched, lay the real folders and the letter. They had found decoys, empty binders, and old notebooks she had placed there herself days ago, half by instinct, half by fear. A ragged laugh escaped her. They thought they had won. She was replacing the false bottom when her phone rang. It was Mason. "Grandma, are you okay? I just found out Mom and Uncle Bradley. They were planning to search your house today while you were out." "They already did," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But they didn't find what they were looking for." "I'm coming over," he said immediately. "No," she replied, firm. "It's not safe for you to be seen helping me right now. Stay where you are. I'll call you later." She hung up before he could argue. Then she gathered the real documents and placed them in a waterproof bag. She needed somewhere safer than the house to store them now, somewhere her children wouldn't think to look. As she was leaving for Matthew's office, her phone rang again. This time it was Bradley. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice falsely casual. "Victoria and I are worried about you. We stopped by earlier, but you weren't home." "You did more than stop by," Eleanor replied coldly. "Breaking and entering is a crime. Bradley?" There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You can't prove anything. Mom, and even if you could, who would believe you? A confused old woman, living alone, imagining things." The threat was naked now. They were ready to paint her as senile, as paranoid. to use her age against her. "I'm not as confused as you think," Eleanor said, and hung up. That night, she sat in the darkened living room, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Her children no longer saw her as their mother. To them, she was an obstacle, and obstacles are meant to be removed. But Thomas's words pulsed through her. Give yourself the power. Decide what comes next. For years, she had lived quietly, trying not to provoke, trying not to see the cruelty that had taken root in the people she had raised. She told herself patience was strength, forgiveness was duty. But forgiveness had only sharpened their hunger. If they wanted a game, then she would play. Not with fists or threats, but with something stronger: patience, cunning, and truth. Eleanor began to sketch a plan in her mind. She would let them think she was weak, let them taste the bitterness of their own greed, and when the time came, she would show them what their father had truly left behind. As she tucked the real documents into a safer hiding place inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf where Bradley and Victoria never bothered to look, she caught her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her hair, silver in the lamplight, framed a face she barely recognized. Lined, yes. Weary, yes, but no longer bowed. She thought of the girl she once was, the woman Thomas had loved, the mother who had once believed her children's laughter was a gift instead of a weapon. That woman was gone. What remained was something sharper, something they had never imagined, and they would not see it coming. The knock on Eleanor's door came just after dusk, soft and hesitant, nothing like the pounding fists of his parents. When she opened it, Mason stood there, tall and awkward in his growing frame, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. His eyes, though, were the same gentle brown he had as a child, wide with worry. "Grandma," he whispered, "can I come in?" She stepped aside without a word. He walked into the living room and sank into the couch, shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight far too heavy for him. "They're fighting again," he said finally. "Mom and Uncle Bradley. About you. About money. It's all they ever talk about now." His voice cracked. "I hate it." Eleanor sat beside him, the distance between them closing in an instant. He was still just a boy, though the world was already trying to harden him. "They think you're hiding something," he continued, glancing at her with eyes both fearful and hopeful. "Are you—" The question pierced her, not with suspicion, but with a kind of plea. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for truth. Eleanor reached for Thomas's journal, which she had retrieved from its new hiding place. Slowly, she opened to a page marked by her husband's steady hand. She placed it in Mason's lap. "They must learn that love is the only wealth that endures." Thomas had written, "If they cannot, then they will lose everything. But if even one soul remains uncorrupted, then our legacy is safe." Mason read in silence, his lips moving slightly over each word. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "He meant me, didn't he?" Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "He meant anyone who still understood what mattered. I believe that's you." For the first time since Thomas's death, a spark of warmth flickered inside her. Here in this boy who had grown up surrounded by greed, yet still carried kindness in his heart, was hope. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They've been searching your room. They think you have papers. Mom told Uncle Bradley that if they find proof, they'll take you to court." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "Then you need help," he said. "You can't fight them alone." She studied his face, so young, so earnest, yet already bearing scars from being raised by wolves. He wasn't wrong. Alone, she was vulnerable. But with him, she wasn't just defending herself. She was building something Thomas would have been proud of. Eleanor closed the journal, resting her hand over his. "Then we'll fight together." His fingers tightened around hers, and in that grip, she felt something she hadn't known in weeks: strength. The game her children thought they were winning had just changed, because now she had an ally. They worked in silence at first, Eleanor and Mason, the dining table littered with folders, envelopes, and the faint smell of old paper. He handled each document carefully, his long fingers tracing lines of text he barely understood. She explained what she could trust: accounts, deeds. But more than anything, she watched the way he listened, the seriousness in his young face. "Why did Grandpa hide all this?" he asked softly, lifting a paper that bore his mother's name crossed out, replaced by Eleanor's. "Because he knew what your parents would become," she said. Her voice caught, but she steadied it. "He wanted me to have the choice to protect what mattered." Mason looked down, his jaw tightening. "They don't care about family. They only care about money." Eleanor reached across the table, touched his hand. "And you?" His eyes lifted to mine, steady and clear. "I care about you." For a moment, the ache in Eleanor's chest softened. Thomas had left her alone. But not entirely. The next morning, Eleanor called Matthews again. His voice was grave when he answered. "Eleanor, I was about to call you. Victoria and Bradley have been to my office, demanding to see all of Thomas's papers. They're making accusations claiming you're hiding assets, that you're not mentally sound." "Can they get access?" she asked, her heart racing. "No," Matthews assured her. "The trusts are ironclad, but they're escalating. Eleanor, this could get uglier." "I know," she said. "Mason has been helping me organize Thomas's records. We're preparing." There was a pause. "Thomas always thought highly of that boy," Matthews said. "Said he had the right integrity, even with a different last name." Eleanor smiled faintly. "He does." "Come by the office tomorrow," Matthews said. "There's something else Thomas left, something I was instructed to give you only if things reached this point." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. What else had Thomas prepared? How far had he seen into this darkness that afternoon, as she was sorting through more documents? The doorbell rang. Victoria stood on the porch, her smile tight, a bouquet of lilies in her arms. "Mom," she said brightly, "I thought I'd check in on you, see how you're doing after yesterday's misunderstanding." Eleanor didn't invite her in. "Breaking into my home wasn't a misunderstanding. Victoria, it was a crime." Victoria's smile faltered, then returned, harder. "Mom, you're confused. Bradley and I were worried about you. That's all. We came to check on you." And the door was open. "We thought something might have happened." "I'm not confused," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "And I'm not scared of you anymore." Victoria's expression shifted, the mask falling away. "You should be. Bradley and I have resources now. We can make things very difficult for you." "Is that why you're here to threaten me?" Victoria thrust the flowers forward. "I'm here to offer you a way out. Tell us what Dad left you. Sign it over to us. We'll take care of you, set up a nice apartment. Pay your bills. You won't have to worry about anything." Eleanor looked at her daughter, this stranger wearing Victoria's face, and felt a wave of grief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. But she didn't bend. "No," she said simply. Victoria's face hardened. "Then we'll see you in court. And when the judge hears how your memory's been failing, how you can't manage on your own anymore, you'll lose everything, including your precious independence." She turned and stalked back to her car. The flowers dropped carelessly on the porch step. Eleanor watched her go, then slowly picked up the lilies. Thomas had always brought her lilies on special occasions. These weren't a gift, they were a mockery. But as she held them, she realized something important. Victoria and Bradley were desperate. They wouldn't be making threats if they had any real leverage. The next morning, Eleanor drove to Matthew's office. When she entered, he was waiting with a sealed envelope on his desk. Thomas's handwriting scrolled across the front, "For my wife, if the children turn against her." "He left this with specific instructions," Matthews explained. "It was only to be opened if Victoria and Bradley tried to take legal action against you." Eleanor's breath caught. "And you think we've reached that point?" Matthews nodded grimly. "They've consulted with an attorney about filing for guardianship. They're moving faster than I anticipated." The envelope trembled in Eleanor's hands as though it held not paper, but the weight of her entire future. Matthews leaned back, giving her space, his gaze steady. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My love, Thomas's handwriting flowed across the page. If you are reading this, then the children have turned against you. I feared it might come to this. I could not change their hearts, but I could ensure they reap what they sow. Their inheritance was never free. Attached to their $12 million are debts, taxes, and liabilities that will surface only if they attempt to take what is yours. Should they push you into court, they will unleash a storm they cannot control. And when the dust settles, they will have nothing. Eleanor's breath caught, the words blurring as she read them again and again. Thomas had crafted not only a gift, but a trap, a net woven so tightly that greed itself would be the blade to cut them down. Matthews slid another folder across the desk. These are the documents, he explained. Legal filings, tax records, loan agreements your husband concealed within the trusts. If the children stay satisfied with what they have, these will never come to light. But the moment they challenge you in court, he tapped the folder. They inherit ruin. Eleanor stared at the papers, her pulse hammering. Part of her recoiled at the thought destroying her own children, watching them fall from luxury into dust. But then she remembered Victoria's threats, Bradley's sneering face, the broken lock on her trunk, the fear that kept her awake at night. They had chosen this path. She lifted her eyes to Matthews. If it comes to that, will you stand with me? His expression softened. I made your husband a promise, and now I make it to you. Yes, when Eleanor returned home, the house felt colder than ever, though the sun streamed through the windows. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open before her, Thomas's words burning into her like fire. For years she had lived in fear of disappointing her children, of losing their affection, of being alone. But now she understood the truth. She had already lost them. What remained was a test, not of motherhood, but of strength. She placed the papers into a locked case, tucking the key into her pocket. Her hands no longer shook. They thought her fragile, defenseless. But they had forgotten where they came from. They had forgotten the woman who had built this family alongside Thomas, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. If it's war they want, she whispered into the stillness, her voice firm, then war they will have. And for the first time, she almost wished they would try. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, its tall ceilings echoing every shuffle and cough. Eleanor sat at the defendant's table beside Matthews, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Bradley and Victoria leaned toward each other, whispering with smug smiles. Their attorneys, sleek and confident in pressed suits, arranged papers with practiced efficiency. They hadn't even looked at Eleanor when they entered, as if she were already gone. Mason sat alone in the row behind Eleanor. Victoria had forbidden him to come, but he'd defied her, slipping out early and taking the bus downtown. When Eleanor spotted him, her heart swelled with gratitude. No matter what happened today, she wasn't alone. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair, called the room to order. Right, V? Right, she announced, scanning the documents before her. A petition for conservatorship. Victoria's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Your Honor, my clients are here because their mother, a woman in declining health, has been concealing assets left by her late husband. We believe she is no longer capable of managing her affairs and request guardianship be transferred to her children. Victoria and Bradley nodded solemnly, masks of concern painted across their faces. Victoria even dabbed at an imaginary tear. We've prepared documentation showing Mrs. Wright's erratic behavior, the lawyer continued. She's been paranoid, secretive, making unfounded accusations against her own children. We have statements from neighbors who've observed her confusion, and preliminary evaluations suggesting cognitive decline consistent with early dementia. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Lies, all of it. But believable lies, especially coming from concerned children worried about their elderly mother. Matthews remained still, calm, waiting. When it was their turn, he rose slowly, his voice measured. Your Honor, my client may be elderly, But she is neither incompetent nor deceitful. What we have here is not a question of her capacity, but of greed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bradley stiffened, his jaw clenching. Mrs. Wright's late husband, Thomas Wright, left his children a substantial inheritance, $12 million to be exact. Yet within weeks of receiving this windfall, they began pressuring their mother to surrender her home, attempted to place her in a care facility against her wishes, and ultimately broke into her residence searching for documents they believed she was hiding. Victoria's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection. These accusations are unfounded and irrelevant to Mrs. Wright's mental capacity. On the contrary, Matthews replied calmly, they speak directly to motivation, which is central to this case. The judge considered for a moment. I'll allow it. Continue. Mr. Matthews. Matthews placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. Before his passing, Thomas Wright prepared extensive documentation. These records reveal that the assets granted to the children in his will were not without burden. Attached to their $12 million are hidden debts, unpaid taxes, and penalties that would activate under specific conditions. The judge flipped through the papers, her eyes narrowing as she read. Are you suggesting, she asked slowly, that the children's inheritance is conditional? Yes, Your Honor, Matthews replied. Conditional and binding. If they had accepted what was given to them, these debts would have remained dormant. By bringing this matter to court, by attempting to seize control of their mother's affairs, they have triggered the very clauses their father designed to protect her. Victoria's face blanched. Bradley half rose from his seat. That's impossible, he barked. You're lying. Order, the judge snapped, slamming her gavel. Matthews adjusted his glasses. I assure you, Your Honor, the signatures, the trusts, and the filings are all legal and valid. Their father anticipated this very scenario. The courtroom hummed with whispers. Victoria and Bradley's lawyers frantically flipped through the documents, their confident expressions draining away with every page. Furthermore, Matthews continued, we have evidence that Mrs. Wright's children fabricated claims about her mental state. We have recordings of them discussing plans to have her declared incompetent so they could access what they believed to be hidden assets. Eleanor sat still, her heart hammering, but her face serene. She thought of Thomas, of the hours he must have spent crafting this protection, of how well he had known their children's hearts. She felt his presence beside her, steady and sure. The judge closed the folder with a decisive thud. The court sees no evidence of incompetence in Mrs. Wright. In fact, she appears to be the only party here showing sound judgment. Petition denied. She turned a stern gaze to Victoria and Bradley. Furthermore, I advise the petitioners to consult financial counsel immediately. This matter has awakened obligations that appear considerable. Victoria crumpled in her seat, her face ashen. Bradley sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the table edge. As they filed out of the courtroom, Eleanor caught Mason's eye. The boy's face showed a mixture of relief and sadness, joy for his grandmother's victory, sorrow for what his mother had become. Eleanor understood. There were no true winners today, only survivors and casualties of greed. Outside, rain fell in soft sheets, washing the courthouse steps. Eleanor stood under Matthew's umbrella, watching Victoria and Bradley huddled with their lawyers, their faces taut with panic. What happens now? She asked quietly. Matthews sighed. The financial consequences will begin immediately. The tax issues alone will consume much of what they received. The penalties for attempting to seize your assets will take care of the rest. They'll lose everything. Nearly, Thomas was thorough. Eleanor nodded slowly. Part of her ached at the thought of her children brought low, but another part, the part that had endured their cruelty, their dismissal, their attempts to lock her away, felt the cold satisfaction of justice. Grandma, Mason appeared at her side, his hoodie damp with rain. Can I come home with you? I don't think I can face Mom right now. Eleanor wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Of course. You're always welcome. As they walked to her car, Eleanor glanced back once more at Victoria and Bradley. They didn't look her way, too absorbed in their collapsing world. She wondered if they would ever understand what they had truly lost today. Not money, but family. not wealth, but love. The rain fell harder as she drove home, washing the world clean. It began slowly, like the first cracks in glass, a frozen account here, a notice in the mail there, but soon the cracks spread, running jagged lines across the glittering facade Victoria and Bradley had built for themselves. Bradley was the first to feel it. His new boat, barely a month old, was repossessed at the marina. He stormed into Eleanor's driveway the next morning, red-faced, spitting fury. "This is your doing," he shouted, pounding on the hood of his car. "You ruined me." Eleanor stood at the window, silent, the curtains drawn just enough to watch. He looked smaller without the arrogance, his bluster deflating when no one answered the door. Eventually, he drove off, tires screeching, but even that sounded desperate rather than powerful. Mason stayed with Eleanor for several days after the court hearing. Victoria had called him repeatedly, alternating between tears and threats, but he refused to return home until she calmed down. They established a routine breakfast together. Then Mason would log into his online classes while Eleanor tended to household tasks. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together, Mason learning the family recipes that Victoria had never bothered to master. "Did you and Grandpa always know?" Mason asked one evening as they kneaded bread dough side by side. "About Mom and Uncle Bradley. I mean, that they'd become like this?" Eleanor sighed, flour dusting her hands as she worked. "We saw signs. When your mother was young, she was different, creative, sensitive. She used to paint. Did you know that beautiful landscapes? But somewhere along the way, she started measuring worth by possessions, not by creation or connection. Why didn't you stop it?" "We tried," Eleanor said softly. "But you can't force someone to value what matters. You can only live by example and hope they find their way back." Victoria's unraveling came more quietly than Bradley's. Creditors began calling her office. Her Florida vacation home, bought in haste and pride, slipped into foreclosure before she had even furnished it. James, her husband, became increasingly distant as the financial strain grew, spending long hours at work and short hours at home. One afternoon, Eleanor saw Victoria sitting in her car outside the house, her face buried in her hands. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor almost went to her. Almost. But then she remembered Victoria's voice on the recording. "We'll make her life so difficult she gives in. Everyone has a breaking point." The whispers spread through town quickly. The proud heirs of Thomas Wright were drowning in debt, their shiny toys stripped away, their names whispered with pity and scorn. Their laughter at the will reading had curdled into bitter silence. Meanwhile, Eleanor walked to the market with her head high. Neighbors who once pitied her now nodded with respect, though none knew the full truth. Only Matthews, Mason, and Eleanor understood the scope of Thomas's design. At night, Mason helped Eleanor transfer more assets quietly, carefully into secure accounts, some in her name, some in his for the future. They worked like architects, rebuilding from ruins, their bond deepening with each late hour spent over papers and signatures. "They're tearing each other apart," he told her one evening, a faint note of awe in his voice. "Mom blames Uncle Bradley. Uncle Bradley blames Mom. They barely speak now. Greed eats itself in the end," Eleanor murmured, her pen scratching across the page. Yet even as satisfaction swelled, there was sorrow, too. These were her children, her babies. Once she had rocked them to sleep, held their hands on their first day of school, kissed away scraped knees. Now, watching them sink, she felt the ache of a mother's heart alongside the triumph of a wronged woman. But Thomas had given her more than wealth. He had given her the power to choose, and she knew now that her choice was not to save them, but to show them the truth of who they had become. After 2 weeks, Victoria and James had a massive fight. Their shouting carried through the neighborhood, culminating in the slam of a car door and the squeal of tires. The next morning, Mason received a text his mother had gone to stay with a friend. James was filing for separation. "I should probably go home," Mason said reluctantly. "Check on things. At least, make sure he's okay." Eleanor nodded. "You should. But remember, You always have a place here." She watched him pack his few belongings, this boy who had become her ally, her comfort, her hope. In him, she saw echoes of Thomas, the quiet integrity, the thoughtfulness, the capacity for loyalty, and something of herself, too, from before life had worn her edges smooth. "I'll call you tonight," he promised at the door. "And I'll be back tomorrow after school." Eleanor hugged him tight. "I know you will." After he left, the house felt emptier, but no longer hollow. There was purpose in the silence now, and peace. The storm had broken. Their empire was gone, and she was still standing. 2 days later, Matthews called with news. "Bradley's filed for bankruptcy," he said without preamble. "Victoria will likely follow suit soon. The tax penalties were even more substantial than we anticipated." "I see," Eleanor said quietly. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. Eleanor, the protections he put in place were comprehensive. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in Thomas's old armchair, gazing out at the garden. The roses needed pruning. Their summer blooms faded now. Thomas had always handled the rose bushes, his large hands somehow gentle with the thorny stems. She would learn to do it herself now. She thought of her children, stripped of their arrogance, facing the consequences of their choices. She had not destroyed them. Thomas's plan had simply ensured they reaped what they had sown. Still, motherhood ran deep, woven into her bones. Despite everything, a part of her ached for them. But she would not rescue them, not this time. Some lessons could only be learned through loss. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. Soft at first, then sharper, more frantic. Eleanor had been reading in bed, Thomas's journal open beside her. She slipped on her robe and moved cautiously to the door, peering through the peephole. On the porch stood Victoria. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked nothing like the woman who had once draped herself in jewels and silk, laughing at Eleanor from behind her glass of wine. She looked broken. "Mother," she whispered when Eleanor opened the door, her voice raw. "Please let me in." Eleanor stepped aside. Victoria entered hesitantly, glancing around the house as though ashamed to be seen there. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. "They took everything," she said, staring at the wood grain. "The cars, the house, even the furniture. James left me. I've been sleeping in a motel, eating from vending machines. I didn't know where else to go." Her words cut through Eleanor, not because of pity alone, but because beneath the ruin, she still saw the girl Victoria had once been, the child who had clung to her hand on her first day of school, who had whispered secrets into her ear at night. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes. "You had somewhere to go," she said quietly. "You always had me, but you chose money instead." Victoria flinched as though struck. "I know," she choked. "I was wrong. I was blind. Please, Mother, just help me." Eleanor rose, went to the stove, and ladled soup from the pot she'd made earlier that day. She placed it in front of Victoria along with a slice of bread. Victoria stared at it as though it were a feast. Slowly, with trembling hands, she ate. When she finished, Eleanor set a blanket on the couch. "You can sleep here tonight," she said. "You'll be safe." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "That's all?" Eleanor met her gaze, steady but not cruel. "That's what I can give. Food, shelter, but not trust, that you spent long ago." Victoria's lips trembled, but she nodded. She lay down on the couch, curling beneath the blanket, her sobs muffled against the cushions. Eleanor returned to her room and called Mason. "Your mother is here," she said quietly. "She's staying the night." "Is she okay?" The concern in his voice spoke volumes about his character. "She's lost everything," Eleanor said. "But she's safe for now. I'll come over tomorrow." "I think that would be good." After hanging up, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to go to Victoria, to stroke her hair as she had when her daughter was small and frightened by nightmares. Another part remained wary, remembering the cruelty, the threats, the recording of Victoria planning to have her declared incompetent. "What would you do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty room. She picked up his journal, opening to a page she had read many times since his death. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not weakness. It is a choice to set down the burden of anger, not for the one who wronged you, but for yourself. Sometimes it must be earned. Sometimes it comes in stages. But always, it must begin with truth. That was what had been missing between them for so long. Victoria had hidden behind masks of success and superiority. Eleanor had hidden behind patience and acquiescence. Perhaps now, stripped of pretense, they could begin to see each other clearly. In the morning, Eleanor found Victoria already awake, folding the blanket neatly. She had washed her face, combed her hair with her fingers, trying to restore some dignity to her appearance. "Thank you," Victoria said stiffly. "For letting me stay." Eleanor nodded, putting on coffee. "Are you hungry?" "I shouldn't impose any further." "It's not an imposition to feed my daughter." Victoria's composure cracked slightly at the word daughter. She sat at the table, watching as Eleanor prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and fruit. They ate in silence until Victoria finally spoke. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small. "How did this happen? The lawyer said something about contingencies in Dad's will. Debts that activated when we tried to—" She couldn't finish. "When you tried to take what wasn't yours," Eleanor completed gently. "Yes, your father knew you might try. He prepared accordingly. But how could he do this to us, his own children?" Eleanor set down her spoon. "He didn't do it to you, Victoria. He did it for me. And perhaps, in his way, for you as well. For me, he ruined me." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Your choices ruined you, your greed, your willingness to cast me aside for money. Thomas simply ensured there would be consequences." Victoria stared at her bowl, tears dropping into the oatmeal. "I thought I was building something. Success, security, a life Mason could be proud of. At what cost? I didn't see it that way then. I just saw opportunities. Chances to finally have everything I wanted." Eleanor reached across the table, not quite touching Victoria's hand, but close. "And what do you want now?" Victoria looked up, her face raw with vulnerability. "I don't know. A second chance. Maybe somewhere to belong." The doorbell rang before Eleanor could respond. Mason stood on the porch, his face tense with apprehension. When he saw his mother at the table, his steps faltered. "Mom!" Victoria rose, uncertain. "Mason, I'm sorry." He stood frozen for a moment, then crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her. Victoria broke then, sobbing into her son's shoulder, clutching him as though he might disappear. Eleanor slipped out of the kitchen, giving them privacy for their reunion. She went to the living room window, watching the neighborhood stirring to life. A jogger passed. A woman walked her dog. A delivery truck rumbled by. Ordinary life continuing while inside her home. Something extraordinary was happening, the first tentative step toward healing. Later, as Victoria prepared to leave, she had a meeting with bankruptcy lawyers. Another step in the long process of rebuilding. She paused at the door. Would it be all right if I came back? Maybe for dinner sometime?" Eleanor considered the request. Not too long ago, Victoria had been plotting to have her declared incompetent, to strip her of her autonomy, her home, her dignity. Trust had been shattered, yet here she stood, humbled, seeking not money now, but connection. "Dinner," Eleanor agreed. "Sunday? Mason can come too." Victoria nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, Mother." After she left, Mason stayed behind, helping Eleanor with household chores. "Do you think she's really changed?" he asked as they washed dishes side by side. Eleanor handed him a plate to dry. "I don't know. People can change when they lose everything, sometimes for the better." sometimes just temporarily, until they find their footing again. Are you going to forgive her? Eleanor sighed, looking out the kitchen window at the garden Thomas had planted, the roses he had tended, the legacy he had built not just of money, but of love. Forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. Mason, it's a journey, not a destination. But you'll try, she smiled at him. This boy who carried hope even through the darkest times. I'll try. The first morning Eleanor woke without dread. The house smelled of cinnamon. She had baked again for the first time in years. Just a simple loaf, the kind Thomas used to love with his coffee. Mason wandered in, his hair a mess, his eyes sleepy. He sniffed the air and grinned. "Grandma, you cooked," he said, almost in disbelief. "I baked," she corrected, sliding the warm loaf onto the counter. "Cooking is survival. Baking is hope," he laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen like sunlight. Days began to take on rhythm. Mason spent weekends at Eleanor's house, helping with repairs and learning the family recipes. Victoria came for Sunday dinners awkward at first, with long silences and careful conversations, but gradually warming as weeks passed. She had found a small apartment and a job as a receptionist at a dental office, humble work compared to her previous lifestyle. But she spoke of it with surprising contentment. Bradley remained distant. His bankruptcy had been finalized, his possessions auctioned, his pride shattered. He had moved to another state, starting over. Eleanor sent him a letter, offering not money, but reconciliation. He hadn't responded, but the letter hadn't been returned either. Eleanor counted that as a small victory. Perhaps in time, he too would find his way back. One evening, as Matthews sat at her dining table reviewing the final changes to her will, he remarked on the transformation. "Thomas would be proud," he said, watching Mason and Victoria in the garden, planting fall bulbs together. "Not just of how you protected yourself, but of how you've created space for healing." Eleanor smiled, signing the last page with a steady hand. This is what he wanted all along, not revenge, but revelation, truth. The new will divided Thomas's assets, now officially Eleanor's, with care and purpose. To Victoria, a modest trust fund that would provide security without excess, conditional on continued employment and community service. To Bradley, the same offer, should he choose to accept it. And to Mason, the bulk of the estate, to be held in trust until he turned 25, with provisions for education, housing, and the foundation Eleanor was establishing in Thomas's name. The Thomas Wright Foundation for Arts Education, Matthews read from the documents. Supporting young artists from low-income families. He would have loved that. He always regretted that Victoria gave up painting, Eleanor said softly. He thought maybe if we'd encouraged her talent more, valued creativity over conformity. Matthews patted her hand. Don't dwell on might-have-beens. Eleanor, look at what you're building now. After he left, Eleanor joined Victoria and Mason in the garden. The autumn light slanted gold across the lawn, catching in Mason's dark hair, warming Victoria's face as she knelt in the soil, planting daffodil bulbs for spring. "These won't bloom for months," Mason complained good-naturedly. "The best things are worth waiting for," Eleanor replied, easing herself onto the garden bench. "Planting them is an act of faith." Victoria sat back on her heels, dirt smudging her cheek. Once she would have been horrified at the indignity. Now she simply laughed. "I remember Dad saying that every fall when we planted the garden. Faith in tomorrow, Vicky girl, that's what flowers teach us." Eleanor's heart tightened at the memory, at the glimpse of the daughter she had thought lost forever. He was right. Later, as the sun set and Victoria prepared to leave for her apartment, she hesitated at the door. "Mom, I've been thinking. I found some of my old paints in storage. I thought maybe I could start again." Eleanor touched her daughter's cheek gently. "I think that would be wonderful." After Victoria left, Mason helped Eleanor clear the dinner dishes. "She's really trying," he observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "She is. And Uncle Bradley," Eleanor sighed. "That may take longer. Some wounds run deeper, but the door is open. if he chooses to walk through it. That night, Eleanor sat in Thomas's old rocking chair on the porch, the autumn wind carrying the scent of leaves and wood smoke. She thought of the path that had brought her here, the laughter of her children at the will reading, the sting of their contempt, the shadow of their threats. She thought of the courtroom, the shock on their faces when Thomas's safeguards activated. She thought of Victoria at her door, broken and seeking shelter. And through it all, she thought of Thomas. For years, she had leaned on his strength. He had been her compass, her protector, her partner. When he died, she feared she had lost not only him, but herself. Yet his last gift was not money or papers. It was faith. Faith that she could stand alone. Faith that she could look into the eyes of betrayal and not break. She lifted his journal, worn now from her hands, and opened to the final page. His last entry, written in his careful script, read, "If you are reading this, then I am gone. But remember, my love, wealth is not measured in accounts. It is measured in courage, in truth, in the hearts we leave behind. You are stronger than you believe. Trust yourself. And know I have trusted you always." Tears blurred the words, but they did not sting as before. These were not tears of grief, but of gratitude. Mason's laughter carried from inside the house, light and unburdened. In him, Eleanor saw not only the future Thomas had spoken of, but proof that their love had not been wasted, that even among thorns, one flower had bloomed. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. "My children may have lost their way," she whispered into the wind, "but I have not lost mine. I have found it again in Mason, in the possibility of Victoria's redemption, in myself, in the strength you left me." The rocking chair creaked as she leaned back. The sunset spilled fire across the horizon. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt whole. They had laughed at her once, certain she was defeated, but she had endured. She had risen, and in the end, it was not their money, nor even Thomas's fortune that mattered. It was the legacy of love, of truth, of resilience. And that, Eleanor knew, was something they could never take from her.